If you follow my reviews, you will know that Neon has absolutely been crushing it when it comes to horror films as of late, producing some of the most compelling, uniquely styled, and even medium-breaking narratives we've seen in the past 15 years. However, with their latest horror film, I did have some concerns. As I mentioned in a previous video, when watching the trailer, it just comes across as a lot of, for a lack of a better term, cringy, self-aware millennial humor. And to be honest, I probably would not have gone to see this film had it not been made by Neon. But since they have had 4 goods in a row, I felt Neon had earned the benefit of the doubt. So, last weekend, I went to go see Hellofasummer. And it was odd. Very odd. It's not a bad movie, but it's not all that good either. So, right off the bat, Hellofasummer is a comedic horror slasher film that, based on the trailer, I thought was going to be more of a parody of the slasher movie genre. But it's not. It is straight up a horror slasher film with a comedic overlay. It's shot and produced just like an OG slasher film from the 1980s, which was really cool. And from an objective standpoint, narratively and technically, there is nothing really wrong with this film, other than 1 or 2 things that I will get into later. However, from a subjective standpoint, the movie isn't boring, but it also wasn't very entertaining. It toes this weird middle line of just being interesting enough throughout the whole film. I don't think this movie is going to do well in theaters, but I feel like this film would have done really well on Netflix or some streaming service, because it very much feels like a TV movie, or like that one film that's always playing in the background. I feel this movie would have done really well with the tween and teen market, but I don't think they're going to pony up the money and go see it in theaters. Which is why I say this film probably would have done way better on a streaming service instead. All in all, again, it's not a bad film, it's just very meh. So, for my highbrow critic score, I give Hellofasummer a 7 out of 10. And for my schmo score, the score for the average Joe Schmo, I give it a 5 out of 10. Now, this is the part where I explain my review scores and I get into spoiler territory. So, if you would like to see Hellofasummer spoiler-free, this is where we part ways. Thanks for showing up, and I want you to have a nice day. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this film does all the basics pretty well. The acting is good, they have clearly defined character archetypes that stay consistent, it has a solid beginning, middle, and end, all under 90 minutes, which, yes, I am always going to bring up runtime, because if you can't tell a complete story in 90 minutes, you probably shouldn't be making movies. Also, I was surprised that there really wasn't any cringy, self-aware millennial humor in this film. Most of the comedy in this movie comes from, these very stupid young people acting like stupid young people. The film makes it clear that these kids are kinda dumb, but they never behave or do anything that is outside of their clearly defined character archetypes. So it works. And also, they never let the comedy hijack the narrative, meaning they never ruin the momentum of the story for a cheap laugh. But speaking of narrative, this is where the problems are. For the majority of the movie, the narrative is pretty solid. In fact, there is only really one thing wrong with it. It has the stereotypical slasher trope of people going off on their own for no reason, the reason being so they can get killed. But the movie only does this 2 times, and it is a classic slasher movie trope. Still, in the efforts of good writing, you really should find a more realistic reason for characters to get isolated from each other than just them wandering off for no reason. No, the real problem with the narrative is that, well, it's not bad writing, it's just weak writing. I'll explain. So, in all stories, they are always working up to some kind of payoff. The biggest payoff being the end where the main conflict of the story is resolved in some way. You know, the rebels defeating the Empire, the 2 lovers getting together, the humans killing the monster. You get it. However, stories will usually have multiple payoffs throughout to keep the momentum of the story going and to reward the audience members for sticking with the story. Like side villain characters getting their comeuppance or a narrative twist reveal. And in Hellofasummer, there are 3 big payoff moments. One being, of course, the ending where the whole killer survival situation is resolved, which was actually pretty good in this case. The problem is how they handled the other 2 payoffs. So, being a slasher horror, of course, one of the big payoffs is going to be the reveal of the killer's identity. And then for this film, they added an extra payoff of, spoilers, there being 2 killers among them. And they did do a really good job of building up to these moments. I genuinely had no idea who the killer was, and I really wanted to find out. Also, I was not expecting 2 killers, which I know is a common slasher trope, but they did a really good job of hiding it. The problem is, when they revealed these big payoffs that they had been building up to this whole time, they kind of randomly just threw it at your feet. Like, they first revealed that there were 2 killers. But it wasn't like one of the characters sees the 2 killers, or better yet, maybe one of the characters gets away from one of the killers only to be shocked and killed by the appearance of a second. That would have been a good reveal. But no, it's just a random scene where both killers just walk into the same room. And there wasn't even any other characters there to see it. So it's just a scene that's letting only the audience members know there's 2 killers. But why? And it's so short, if you're not paying attention, you will probably miss it. On top of that, not 5 minutes later, they reveal who the 2 killers are. And again, not because any character in the film has figured out who they are, the scene exists just to let us, the audience, know who the killers are. For reasons? Which is fine, narratively speaking, because it goes from a whodunit situation to will the survivors figure it out before the 2 killers murk everyone. And that's why this is so frustrating, because technically, the writers didn't make a mistake. This isn't an example of bad writing, it's just weak writing. I mean, these are your 2 big narrative payoffs that you just spent all this time and effort building up to, and you don't want to, jazz it up a bit, add some panache, some pine ass? No? Okay. And by having these lackluster reveals, it has a negative effect on the rest of the movie. Because the build-up and all the in-between scenes are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But with such a weak payoff reveal, it's going to make the audience look back at those scenes that they just spent their time watching with way more scrutiny. The sort of, I wasted my time for this? The movie wasn't even that good. Which is not necessarily true. The payoffs are good, they are just presented very poorly. And the building up and the in-between scenes are fine. It's just with the absence of satisfying payoffs, You're going to focus more harshly on these scenes to try and justify the time you gave up in watching them, creating this big mess of emotions that I think will end up making most people feel like this movie is boring or a waste of time. The lesson here being, you really need to deliver your payoffs in a manner that feels more satisfying. Because if your payoffs feel unimportant or meh, it will make your entire movie feel unimportant or meh, despite not actually being a bad movie. So there it is. Maybe this film will do better once it hits streaming services, but we'll see. Anyways, thanks for being here. I appreciate you, and I'll catch ya at the next one.